The signal came from the edge of the Velhari star system, weak and fragmented, like the last breath of a dying man desperately reaching for something to hold. It crossed 14 light-years of empty space, bouncing off relay stations, degrading with every passing second, before it finally reached the receiving arrays of the United Human Exploration Fleet stationed near the border of the Conclave's outer rim. Lieutenant Priya Akafer was the one who caught it. She was halfway through a cold cup of coffee and a maintenance report when the alert chimed on her console. At first she thought it was interference, a natural pulsar blip, maybe a malfunctioning relay. But then the pattern repeated, then again, and then the translation matrix kicked in and the words appeared on her screen in cold, clean text. "We are dying, please, anyone, we are dying." She sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then she hit the command channel open. "Admiral Ven to the bridge, Admiral Ven to the bridge, now." Admiral Kassara Ven was not a woman who moved slowly under any circumstances, but the tone in Akafer's voice brought her through the bridge doors in 40 seconds flat, still pulling her uniform jacket straight. She was 47 years old, with the kind of face that had seen enough of the universe to stop being surprised by it. Sharp eyes, gray threading through dark hair at the temples, and a jaw set with the permanent expression of someone quietly calculating 3 solutions to a problem you hadn't even identified yet. She read the signal, she read it again. "Source," she said. "Velsura, Velhari homeworld, about 6 light-years from our current position." Ven pulled up the tactical display. The Velhari, she knew them. Everyone in the fleet knew them. An ancient civilization, one of the oldest in the Conclave. They had been cataloging stars when humanity was still figuring out agriculture. They were scholars, philosophers, physicians. They had no standing military. They had never needed one. For 400 years, they had existed under the Conclave's collective security agreement, which, in practice, meant that 14 different species had promised to help them if anything went wrong, and had spent 400 years grateful that nothing ever did. Something had gone wrong. Ven pulled up the Kreth Dominion files. She had read them before twice, actually, because she was the kind of officer who read files she wasn't required to. The Kreth were what happened when a species evolved to solve every problem with overwhelming force and never developed the philosophical framework to question whether that was a good idea. 14 star systems consumed in 60 years. Billions dead. The Dorvai Collective gone. The Shan Protectorate gone. The Velhari had been on the projected expansion path for years. The Conclave had held 17 emergency sessions about it. 17 sessions, 17 resolutions, 0 action. Ven closed the file. "Get me the Conclave emergency channel," she said. The communications officer opened it. The channel was already alive with noise, dozens of Conclave species talking over each other, debating, requesting procedural votes, arguing about jurisdiction and response protocols, and whether intervention would violate the Kreth's sovereign rights under Article 7 of the Galactic Compact. Ven listened for exactly 90 seconds. Then she muted the channel. "Navigation," she said very calmly. "Plot a jump to the Velsura system." "Admiral, we haven't received authorization from." "Navigation." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "Plot the jump." "Yes, Admiral." She opened a fleet-wide channel. Every ship in the task group, 8 vessels, 2 carriers, 3 destroyers, 3 engineering and logistics cruisers, received her voice at the same moment. "This is Admiral Ven. We've received a distress signal from the Velhari homeworld. The Kreth Dominion is moving on their system. We are responding. I'm not going to tell you this is going to be simple or safe because it isn't. I'm going to tell you that there are people 6 light-years from here who are dying and they called out into the dark and we heard them. Prep your stations. We jump in 20 minutes. She closed the channel. LT. Akafer was looking at her from across the bridge. "The Conclave is going to be furious," Akafer said quietly. Ven picked up her cold coffee, took a sip and made a face. "The Conclave," she said, "can file a complaint." 22 minutes later, Vin had never quite managed the 20-minute mark. The fleet vanished from the outer rim and reappeared in the light of Velsura's golden sun. What they saw on the tactical display made every person on every bridge fall completely silent. The Kreth advance fleet was already there. 43 warships in a hammer formation, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the third planet. The planet itself was broadcasting on every frequency, not just the distress signal now, but thousands of individual voices, terrified and overlapping, a chorus of a civilization that had lived in peace for centuries and had absolutely no idea what to do with the thing that was coming for them. Admiral Vin set down her coffee cup. "Weapons," she said. "Warm everything up." Elder Suharan had lived for 212 years. In that time he had watched stars born and stars die. He had read every major philosophical text produced by 37 civilizations. He had debated the nature of consciousness with minds that operated on timescales incomprehensible to most species. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that he was not easily surprised anymore. Then the humans arrived, and he discovered he had been wrong about that. He had expected warships. What came through the jump point was indeed warships, 8 of them, sleek and dark, moving with a quiet, purposeful aggression that made even the Kreth advance fleet hesitate. The lead vessel, the UHES Resolute, broadcast on the Kreth command frequency within seconds of arrival. No preamble, no diplomatic language. "This is Admiral Kassara Vin, United Human Exploration Fleet. You are in violation of Conclave-protected space. You have 4 hours to withdraw your vessels beyond the system boundary. This offer will not be repeated." The Kreth did not respond immediately. In the bunkers beneath Velsura's capital, the Velhari watched the tactical feeds in stunned silence. They outnumbered the humans 5-1. Everyone in the room understood that. And yet something in the tone of that broadcast, flat, certain, carrying the specific weight of a person who has already decided what happens next and is simply allowing you the courtesy of a warning, made the Kreth hesitate. They withdrew to the system boundary. It was a tactical repositioning, everyone understood that. They were waiting for the rest of their armada. They would be back in force within weeks. But for now, there was silence, and in that silence, the humans did something that Elder Suharan had not anticipated at all. They started building. It began within hours of the Kreth withdrawal. The logistics cruisers opened their cargo bays and deployed construction drones by the hundreds, small, fast, utterly purposeful machines that spread across the surface of Velsura like a silver tide. Human engineering teams beamed down in shuttles, not with weapons in hand, but with survey equipment, ground-penetrating scanners, geological analysis kits. They moved through the Velhari cities with polite efficiency, asking permission before they set foot on anything, explaining their purpose with patient translators, and then getting to work with a speed that made Suharan's head swim. He approached Admiral Vin directly on the second day. She was standing at a mobile command station on the edge of the capital city's outer district, studying a 3-dimensional topographical map that her engineers had generated overnight. Around her, humans worked in organized chaos, arguing loudly about load-bearing ratios, yelling measurements across distances, laughing at jokes Suharan couldn't understand, and consuming truly alarming quantities of a hot, dark liquid they called coffee. "Admiral," Suharan said carefully through his translator, "we are grateful for your presence, but I must ask, what is it that you are doing?" Vin looked at him. She had the eyes of someone who never stopped calculating, but there was something warm in them too, something that surprised him. She pointed at the map. "You see this valley here? Natural defensive choke point. We're going to anchor the primary shield array along this ridgeline and sink the power cores 200 meters underground so they survive orbital bombardment. The main fortress wall will run here to here, about 40 kilometers of reinforced composite paneling over a gravitic anchor lattice. Civilian bunkers along this entire underground corridor, capacity for about 8 million. Food synthesis units, water recyclers, medical bays." Suharan stared at the map. "You are going to build all of this?" "We already started, Ven said, and nodded toward the eastern valley where, even as they spoke, massive drilling rigs were breaking ground. We've got 6 weeks before the Kreth main fleet arrives, probably less. 6 weeks, Suharan repeated faintly. Admiral, our own construction projects take decades. Ven smiled. It was not an arrogant smile. It was the smile of someone who had heard this before and found it more funny than impressive. We're human, she said simply. We don't really do slow. What followed over the next weeks was something that every Velhari who witnessed it would describe for the rest of their lives, and their children would describe after them, and their children's children would teach in schools long after every human who built it was gone. Fortress Ven rose from the skin of Velsora like something the planet itself had decided to grow, vast, layered, intricate, and terrifyingly purposeful. The main walls were 300 kilometers in span. The shield arrays, when tested, lit up the night sky like a second aurora. Orbital weapons platforms were anchored at 5 gravitational nodes above the planet, each one capable of tracking and engaging targets at ranges that made Velhari physicists quietly recalculate what they thought they knew about human weapons technology. But it was the smaller things that moved Suharan most. The bunkers built not just with survival in mind, but with dignity, wide corridors, lighting calibrated for Velhari optical ranges, spaces for families to stay together, medical stations staffed and stocked before the crisis had even arrived. Human engineers asking Velhari civilians what they needed, writing it down, and then going away and making it happen. On the 38th day, a young human engineer named Tors, barely 25 years old, paint-stained and exhausted, sat down next to Suharan on a low wall at the end of his shift and looked out at the fortress that now dominated the horizon. "Do you think it'll hold?" Suharan asked. Tors considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Against what they're bringing, yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think it'll hold." He paused, then grinned. "Besides, we built the gun batteries with a 40% overspec margin just in case." Just in case of what? In case we needed to shoot something really, really far away. Somewhere above them, the Kreth's 6th Grand Armada was moving through the dark. Word travels fast in a galaxy connected by quantum relay networks, and the news that humanity had unilaterally deployed to Velsora, without conclave authorization, without diplomatic clearance, without so much as a strongly worded letter to the relevant interstellar committees, spread across 37 civilizations within 72 hours. The reactions were varied and, from humanity's perspective, largely irrelevant. The Tharan hegemony filed a formal protest with the conclave, citing humanity's violation of non-intervention protocols. The conclave scheduled a hearing. The hearing was postponed due to a procedural dispute about quorum rules. The Duresi Collective sent a strongly worded diplomatic communication to the human home system, expressing concern about destabilization of the galactic order. The Human State Department acknowledged receipt of the communication and noted it would be reviewed in due course. The Asavari Merchant Alliance quietly moved 3 of their trade vessels out of the projected conflict zone and said nothing publicly, which was the most sensible thing anyone did. And then there were the observers. 6 conclave species sent observation vessels to the Velsora system, officially to monitor the situation and report back to the conclave, unofficially because what humanity was doing was so unprecedented and so strange that nobody could quite look away. They arrived in the system to find Fortress Ven already rising from the planet's surface and spent their time doing something they were not accustomed to doing, being speechless. Commander Erix of the Tharan Observer Vessel Careful Consideration filed daily reports back to the hegemony. His early reports were professional and measured. By day 10, they had become something else entirely. Day 10 report. Construction continues at an impossible pace. I have revised my estimate of their completion timeline 3 times. I no longer trust my own estimates. Their engineering core operates on a 20-hour work cycle with rotating shifts. They appear to sleep in 4-hour intervals. I am not sure this is healthy, but it is producing results I cannot dispute. The primary wall section is 40% complete. Day 18 report. I watched a human engineer this morning work for 11 hours without a break, argue loudly with her supervisor about the optimal load-bearing coefficient for a section of the shield array, be proven correct, receive no apology, accept this as normal, and immediately begin work on the next section. I find humans deeply confusing. Day 31 report. The orbital weapons platforms came online today. We ran passive scans. I am filing this report with a classified addendum that I have marked for the hegemon's eyes only because the numbers I obtained would cause a public panic. In summary, do not threaten these people. Day 38 report. The fortress is complete. I have run out of words. Back on Velsura, Suharan was reading some of these intercepted reports. The Velhari had their own intelligence services, gentle and old as they were, and finding them grimly satisfying. The galaxy had watched them be left to die for years. The galaxy could watch them be defended now. But it was what happened on Day 40 that truly sent shockwaves through the Conclave's communication networks. A Kreth probe fleet, 12 fast attack vessels sent ahead of the main armada to conduct reconnaissance and test human response times, entered the Velsura system at high speed. Standard Kreth doctrine for probe fleets was to make one attack pass, assess the damage dealt and the damage received, and retreat to report. It was how they had operated for 60 years. It had worked every single time. The Kreth probe fleet entered the system at dawn, Velsoran time, moving fast and in formation. Fortress Ven's orbital sensors acquired them at the system boundary. The targeting solutions were calculated, confirmed, and approved in 11 seconds. The first orbital rail battery fired at a range the Kreth had never encountered before, far beyond what their tactical databases listed as human weapons capacity. The lead Kreth vessel ceased to exist. The second and third vessels began evasive maneuvers, but the tracking systems had already compensated. 2 more shots, 2 more vessels gone. The remaining 9 probe ships broke formation and ran. Of those 9, 3 made it back to the system boundary. The other 6 were engaged by the human destroyers that had been waiting, quietly and patiently, on the dark side of Velsura's moon. The probe fleet did not report back to the Armada. It had nothing left to report with. Admiral Ven received the engagement report in her command center, reviewed it, noted the efficiency rating was within projected parameters, and approved the maintenance cycle for the orbital batteries. Then she poured herself a coffee, walked out onto the observation platform at the top of the command tower, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, 4,000 Kreth warships were coming. She took a slow sip. The coffee was, for once, at exactly the right temperature. "All right," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Come on then." Kreth's 6th Grand Armada was the largest military force assembled in the known galaxy in 200 years. 4,216 warships, 17 dreadnought-class capital vessels, each one the size of a small moon, troop transports carrying 6 million ground soldiers, specialized siege platforms designed to crack planetary shield arrays that had never encountered anything like Fortress Ven. They had conquered the Dorvai Collective with 800 ships. They had erased the Shan Protectorate with 1,200. 4,000 ships had felt like overkill when the Kreth High Command had assembled the Armada. A message to the galaxy. A demonstration that there was no point in resistance. They entered the Velsura system in full battle formation at 300 hours, Velsoran local time. In the civilian bunkers beneath the fortress, 8 million Velhari were awake. No one had been able to sleep. Children pressed against their parents. Elderly scholars held the hands of young students. Elder Suharan stood at the observation screen in Bunker 7, watching the tactical feed, watching those 4,000 contacts appear on the display like a plague of stars. He felt something he had not felt since he was a child, a pure, animal terror that all his centuries of philosophy could not reason away. Then Admiral Ven's voice came over the bunker's broadcast system, calm as still water. "Velsoran people, this is Admiral Ven. I need you to stay in the bunkers, stay calm, and trust us. That's all I'm asking, just trust us." A pause. "We've been waiting for them." The first engagement began at 3:12 hours, when the Kreth Armada crossed the outer defense perimeter, a range that, by every tactical database in the galaxy, was far beyond weapons range. The Kreth fleet commanders had accounted for the orbital batteries. Their tactical AI had studied the probe engagement and calculated effective countermeasures. What the tactical AI had not accounted for was that the orbital batteries were not humanity's primary weapon. At 3:12 hours, the 5 orbital platforms fired simultaneously, not at ships, at specific gravitational coordinates that human physics had calculated 6 weeks ago, on the second day of construction, when the engineering teams had not been just building a fortress but designing an entire engagement trap. The shots detonated at calculated points in the Armada's formation, creating cascading interference fields that collapsed the Kreth fleet's communication network. 4,000 ships, suddenly deaf and blind to each other. In the 3 seconds of confusion that followed, Admiral Venn gave the order she had been sitting on for 6 weeks. "All batteries, full engagement, fire at will." What happened next lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes and was recorded by every observation vessel in the system in complete, paralyzed silence. The human destroyers came around the moon at attack speed. The orbital batteries cycled and fired, with a rhythm that was almost mechanical in its precision. The Kreth dreadnoughts, those 17 capital vessels that had cracked the Dorvi's orbital defenses in a single pass, found that their siege platforms could not lock onto Fortress Venn's shield array, because the array's frequency modulation was shifting 16 times per second, driven by an AI that had been trained specifically on Kreth siege warfare. The Kreth adapted. They always adapted. They were a warrior species and they were not stupid, and after the first hour they reorganized despite the communication disruption, fell back on their chain of command doctrine, and pushed 300 vessels into a focused assault on the planetary shield directly above the capital. It was the right tactical call. It would have worked against any other defender. The shield held, not because it was impenetrable. 300 warships were putting enough energy into that single point to melt a continent, but because Fortress Venn had not one shield array but 6, layered concentrically, each one handoff linked to the next, and as each layer absorbed its maximum load and flickered, the next one activated seamlessly beneath it. Human engineering at its most stubborn and obsessive. In Bunker 7, Suharan watched the tactical feed and felt the ground shake and watched the shield percentages fluctuate and hold and fluctuate and hold, and he gripped the hand of the young student beside him, a girl named Veli, 17 years old and studying astronomical cartography, and she gripped back and neither of them spoke. At hour 3, the Kreth attempted a flanking maneuver, a classic encirclement pattern that had served them perfectly against the Dorvi. A third of the Armada broke off and looped around the planet's axis at high speed. They were met by the thing humanity had placed on the dark side of the planet specifically, because human tacticians had war-gamed this exact scenario 16 times in the planning phase. A minefield of gravitational anchor charges, placed so precisely that navigating through them was geometrically impossible at combat speed. 47 Kreth vessels attempted it. None of them made it through intact. At hour 4, the Kreth High Command, watching their Armada bleed ships at a rate their models had never projected, their communication still fractured, their flagship dreadnought running at 30% capacity after a sustained orbital battery exchange, made the decision. They broke off. 4,000 ships became 3,200 in 4 hours. The ones remaining turned and moved toward the system boundary, not en route. The Kreth were too proud for route, but in the specific, controlled retreat of a force that has encountered something it did not calculate for, and has decided that recalculation is necessary. Admiral Venn watched them go from the command tower. Around her, the bridge crew was very quiet, not the quiet of relief, but the quiet of people who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and were only now, slowly, letting it go. Akafor put a hand briefly on Ven's shoulder. Ven allowed it. Down in Bunker 7, the tactical display showed the Kreth contacts moving away from Velsora. Moving away. Suharan stared at it for a long time. Then the young student Veli made a small sound beside him, not words, just a sound, and then she was crying. And then others around her were crying. And then the bunker was full of it. This enormous, released, human-sounding grief that was not grief at all but its opposite. Suharan did not cry. He sat very still and looked at the tactical display and thought about 4,000 ships and 6 weeks of building, and one human woman who had said we are already moving and meant every word. He thought, what manner of species is this? The celebrations on Velsora lasted exactly 1 day before Admiral Ven called a meeting that nobody was ready for. The senior Velhari Council had gathered with Ven's command staff in the main operations room of Fortress Ven, a vast, high-ceilinged space filled with holographic displays, and the quiet hum of systems still running at combat readiness. The Velhari counselors came in the mood of people who had just survived something unsurvivable and wanted to talk about relief efforts, reconstruction, and diplomatic overtures to the conclave. Ven was standing at the central display with a star map open. It showed the Kreth Dominion's territory, a wide red stain across 14 systems, bordered by the scars of what used to be the Dorvai Collective and the Shan Protectorate. She did not wait for everyone to sit down. They'll be back, she said. 12 weeks, maybe 14 if they need to refit the dreadnoughts. They'll come with more ships this time, and they'll come with a new plan specifically designed for this fortress. The room was very quiet. The fortress will hold, she continued, through a second engagement, probably a third, but attrition will eventually favor them. They have more ships than we have batteries, and they will keep coming until one of those equations changes. Then what do you propose? Asked Council Head Muran, an older Velhari woman whose composure had been extraordinary throughout the entire siege. Ven reached out and moved her finger across the star map, tracing a line from Velsora into the deep red of Kreth space. We change the equation, she said. We take the war to them. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier. I want to be very clear about what I mean, Ven said. I'm not talking about conquest. I'm not talking about destruction of civilian infrastructure. We are not the Kreth. She highlighted 3 points in their territory: a massive orbital construction facility, a weapons research installation, and the primary command hub of the 6th Grand Armada. I'm talking about these. Their shipyards, their weapons foundries, their command infrastructure. Without these, they cannot wage war at scale. Without the ability to wage war at scale, they are a civilization, aggressive, difficult, unpleasant, but manageable. With these, they are an extinction event waiting to happen to every species in this region of the galaxy. Suharan spoke from the far end of the table. His voice was careful. You are talking about going into their space. Yes. With how many ships? 3 battle groups, 14 vessels total, plus the engineering corps. The engineering corps, Muran repeated. We'll need to establish forward positions, Ven said, with the particular tone of someone explaining something that is obvious to her and understands it is not obvious to others. We can't conduct extended operations without resupply infrastructure, so we build it as we go. Admiral, Suharan leaned forward. The Conclave will not sanction an offensive operation into Kreth territory, the political fallout. With respect, Elder, Ven said, the Conclave did not come when you called. We did. I am not asking the Conclave for permission to protect the people who asked for my help. She paused. I am, however, asking you. Suharan looked at her for a long moment. Outside the windows of Fortress Ven, Velsora's sky was golden with morning, and somewhere in that sky, 8 million people were emerging from bunkers, blinking in the light, trying to figure out how to begin rebuilding their lives. You are asking us, he said slowly, whether we give you our blessing to go and destroy the thing that has been destroying others for 60 years. Yes. Others who called for help, Suharan said. Others who the Conclave did not come for. Ven said nothing. She let the weight of that sit in the room. Suharan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were very clear. "You have our blessing, Admiral." The battle groups jumped within 48 hours. Ven left Commander Akafar in command of Velsura's defenses. The fortress was more than sufficient, and Akafar was more than capable, and took the Resolute and her companions into Kreth space on a heading that no human military force had ever traveled before. What followed over the next 3 weeks became known in military history as the Velsuran Campaign, though that name always struck the humans who fought it as slightly grandiose. They didn't think of it as a campaign, exactly. They thought of it the way they thought about most things they did, as a problem that needed solving, and the solution happening to require both warships and people who were very, very good at breaking specific things. The first target was the 6th Armada's primary repair and resupply installation, a massive orbital structure near the Kreth border world of Keth Prime. Human destroyers engaged the defense platforms while the engineering corps, which Ven had insisted on bringing to the bafflement of her tactical staff, deployed not to sabotage the installation but to systematically and permanently dismantle it. Every power coupling, every fabrication unit, every weapons assembly line. Not burned, not bombed, taken apart with the same methodical precision with which they had built Fortress Ven, and left as inert scrap. The Kreth ground commander at Keth Prime, a battle-hardened veteran named Grakovith who had never in 40 years of service encountered anything he didn't understand, watched the human engineering team's work, and reportedly stood very still for a long time before turning to his second in command and saying, in a tone that would be quoted in Kreth historical records for a century, "These people are not like anything we have fought before." The second target was the Dominion's main weapons research installation. The third was the command node hub. Both fell within 10 days of each other, and both were dismantled, not destroyed, a distinction that Ven was precise about. She wanted the Kreth to be unable to wage war. She did not want them to be unable to survive. When the battle groups returned to Velsura on the 22nd day, the Kreth High Command had still not retaliated in force. They were too busy calculating what had just happened to them. And what had happened to them, what humanity had done, was not something their entire military philosophy had a framework for. They had been declawed, systematically, surgically, without hatred or malice, by a species that had shown up 6 weeks ago to protect someone else. The Galactic Conclave had not been this fractured since the interregnum wars of 4 centuries past. 41 species, 62 factions, 107 competing interests, all of them looking at the same set of facts and arriving at conclusions that shared almost no common ground. The facts themselves were simple enough. Humanity had deployed to Velsura without authorization. Humanity had defeated the Kreth 6th Grand Armada. Humanity had penetrated Kreth sovereign space and systematically dismantled the Dominion's war-making capability. The Kreth, for the first time in 60 years of expansion, had requested a ceasefire. It was that last fact that had truly undone the Conclave's composure. In 6 decades of Kreth aggression, the Conclave had filed protests, passed resolutions, issued condemnations, proposed negotiations, and accomplished nothing. In 6 weeks, humanity had accomplished what every diplomat, strategist, and committee in the known galaxy had failed to achieve. And they had done it, as Ambassador Velshara of the Asavari Merchant Alliance noted in a private communication that was widely leaked. Without asking anyone's permission, without seeking anyone's approval, and apparently while arguing constantly among themselves about engineering specifications. The Tharan hegemony was furious. Their representative, High Delegate Sauron, delivered a 40-minute address to the full conclave session in which he used the words reckless, unilateral, and precedent-setting so many times that the session translator logged it as statistically anomalous. Humanity was setting a precedent, Sauron argued, for any sufficiently powerful species to simply ignore conclave law whenever they personally decided a situation warranted it. This was dangerous. This was destabilizing. This was precisely the kind of behavior that led to galactic disorder. The human representative to the conclave, Ambassador Huang Lifeng, sat through the entire address with the expression of someone waiting politely for a bus that is very late. When Soren finished, she stood up. High Delegate Soren's concerns about precedent are noted, she said. I would ask the conclave to consider, however, what precedent was set by the 17 emergency sessions held on Kreth expansion over the past 12 years, at the end of which 14 civilizations had been destroyed, and the Velhari were broadcasting a dying signal into empty space. What precedent did we set then? She paused, letting the silence do the work that words couldn't. Because I want to be very clear about what humanity's precedent is. Our precedent is that when someone calls for help, we come. That's it. That is the entirety of the precedent. If other species find that destabilizing, I would invite them to examine why. She sat down. The conclave was silent for 11 seconds, which was, for a body of 41 species that had never agreed on anything quickly, practically instantaneous. Meanwhile, the Kreth ceasefire request had landed on Ven's command desk, and Ven had looked at it, then looked at her staff, then said, "Get me a legal team," which was perhaps the most human response possible to a situation that every other species would have handled with either celebration or revenge. The terms humanity sent back to the Kreth High Command were precise, extensive, and in the view of several conclave legal scholars, extraordinarily reasonable given the circumstances. The Kreth were required to withdraw from all 14 occupied systems, effective within 90 days. All surviving populations of conquered species were to be released and provided transport home. The Dominion's military was to be reduced to a defensive force level, enough to protect their original borders, not enough to threaten anyone else, and the reduction was to be conducted under direct human observation. A reconstruction fund was to be established, drawn from Kreth economic reserves, to assist the rebuilding of the species they had destroyed. And the Kreth High Command was to submit to a joint tribunal review of the campaign of conquest, not for punishment, Ven specified, but for the historical record, so that what had been done to the Dorvai and the Shan and the 12 others was not forgotten or minimized or gradually rewritten into something more comfortable. High Command Grakovith, who had been elevated to lead the ceasefire negotiations after demonstrating, by his own standards, the extraordinary personal quality of understanding that you had lost, read the terms and said nothing for a very long time. His aide asked what he thought. I think, Grakovith said slowly, that these are the terms of a species that has thought very carefully about what justice looks like, which means they are not a species to be treated lightly, ever, under any circumstances, for as long as we exist. He signed the terms. The conclave, which had expected humanity to either demand annexation of Kreth territory or simply withdraw in triumph, found itself looking at a ceasefire document that was more carefully considered than any treaty their own diplomatic corps had produced in living memory. Ambassador Huang, who had been awake for 31 hours straight negotiating the legal language, was reportedly found asleep at her desk by her aide with a half-eaten sandwich next to her. Some things about humans the galaxy was beginning to understand could not be explained. They could only be witnessed. The ceasefire held. The Kreth pulled back. The occupied systems began, slowly and painfully and with enormous difficulty, the process of trying to reconstruct civilizations from the rubble of conquest. And humanity, which had every reason to pack up and go home, did not pack up and go home. This was the part that nobody had expected. The engineering corps stayed. Not all of them. The warships rotated back. The battle group stood down. Admiral Ven herself returned to the fleet and spent 3 weeks writing the most comprehensive after-action report in the history of the United Human Exploration Fleet. But the engineers stayed, and then more engineers came, and then ships arrived that carried not weapons but equipment, and the equipment was for building things that had nothing to do with war. On Velsura, a university went up on the hill 2 kilometers from Fortress Ven. Not a human university, a Velhari one, rebuilt and expanded from the one the Kreth bombardment had damaged in the opening hours of the siege. Human architects worked alongside Velhari designers, and the result was something that neither species would have produced alone. A building that moved with the wind, its walls made of a composite that human materials science had developed, and Velhari aesthetic philosophy had shaped into something genuinely beautiful. Then came a hospital, then an agricultural development center, because the siege had disrupted Velsora's southern farming regions and recovery was going to take years, and human agroengineering had technologies that could cut that timeline significantly. Then a trade port, because the humans had also apparently decided while they were there that Velsora's position in the local star cluster made it a natural hub for commerce, and had drafted a proposal for a trade network that 3 neighboring species were already expressing interest in. Elder Suharan watched all of this with an emotion he had no prior experience of. He was 214 years old. He had been certain, after a century of careful observation, that he understood the fundamental nature of most civilizations in the galaxy. The humans had thoroughly dismantled that certainty, and he found, to his own surprise, that he was not upset about it. He sought out Admiral Ven on one of her visits back to Velsora, 6 months after the battle. She was standing in the half-finished university courtyard, looking at the construction with the expression of someone reviewing work and finding it satisfactory. A mug of coffee was, inevitably, in her hand. "Admiral," he said, settling next to her, "I have a question that I have been considering for some time." "Ask it," she said. "Why are you still here? The war is over, the ceasefire is signed, the Kreth are withdrawing. You defended us magnificently, unambiguously, in a way that history will record. You could leave now with full honor and full credit. Why do your people stay and continue to build?" Ven looked at the university. She was quiet for a moment. In the particular way she was quiet when she was going to say something she had thought about carefully. "When I was young," she said, "there was a story we told about a man who saves a drowning person, pulls them out of the river, gets them breathing, and then walks away feeling good about himself. But the person he saved is cold and injured and has no idea where they are or how to get home. They needed more than being pulled out of the water. They needed someone to stay long enough to make sure they were actually okay." She looked at Suharan. "You called into the dark for help, we came, but you didn't just need the Kreth stopped. You needed everything that was interrupted by the Kreth to start again, and some of it you need help with, and we're here and we're capable of helping. So we stay." She took a sip of coffee. "Also, Tors has apparently fallen in love with a Velhari architect, so there's that." Suharan laughed, a long, genuine, surprised laugh that startled a pair of birds from the courtyard tree. He hadn't laughed like that in a very long time. "There is no word in our language for what your people are," he said when he had composed himself. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he thought carefully, "there are words for warriors, words for protectors, words for builders, words for healers. You are all of these simultaneously without apparent effort. But more than that, you are those things not for yourselves, not for glory or territory or resources. You are those things for others. Every civilization we know builds for itself first. You build for others first and seem to find it unremarkable." Ven said nothing for a moment. Then, "It doesn't feel unremarkable to us. It just feels like the right thing to do." Suharan nodded slowly. He reached into his robe and brought out a small book, hand-bound, The Velhari Way, with pressed fibers from a plant that grew only in Velsora's southern highlands. He had been writing in it for weeks. "We have been working," he said, "on a new word, something for the Velhari lexicon that has not been needed before." He opened the book to a page near the middle. "We are calling your people Vithari." He showed Ven the page, where the word was written in the flowing Velhari script. "It means, as closely as I can translate, those who build homes in other people's storms." Admiral Kassara Ven looked at the word for a long time. Her expression was, for one of the very few times Suharan had observed, genuinely unguarded. Something moved through it that she didn't try to contain. "That's," she started and stopped. Then quietly, "that's the best thing anyone has ever called us." 40 years passed. Velsora became something none of the projections had entirely predicted, though in retrospect it seemed inevitable. The trade port humanity had proposed became the busiest commercial hub in the local cluster. The university became one of the most respected institutions in the known galaxy, not just for Velhari, but for students from 30 species who came to study in a place where, uniquely, two entirely different civilizations had decided to think together. The hospital, expanded 3 times, pioneered a fusion of human and Velhari medical techniques that reduced mortality from 17 known diseases across multiple species. Fortress Ven still stood. It had never needed to fire its weapons again after the day the Kreth Armada broke. Slowly, over the decades, it had transformed from a military installation into something else, part monument, part civic center, part residential district. Humans and Velhari lived in it side by side. Children who had been born there had never known it as anything other than home. The great shield arrays were still maintained, still tested every year, because no one who lived in them had forgotten what they were for. But life had grown up around them and through them, the way life always does around things that were built with care. The Kreth, for their part, had kept the terms. All occupied systems restored, war fleet reduced, reconstruction fund established and actually paid into, which had surprised nearly everyone. Grakoveth, who had survived long enough to see his civilization begin the long and painful process of becoming something other than what it had been, gave a speech to his own people in the 40th year that was later translated and distributed to every species in the galaxy. He said, among other things, "We thought strength was the capacity to destroy. The humans showed us that the greater strength is the capacity to build, and to build for those you have no obligation to. We are still learning what to do with this knowledge, but we have not forgotten the lesson." Elder Suharan did not live to see the 40th year. He died in the 29th, at the age of 241, which was old even for the Velhari, and he died in the university he had watched being built from a courtyard where Admiral Ven had told him about a man and a drowning person, and a story about staying. He died surrounded by students, Velhari and human, and 2 other species who had taken up residence on Velsora over the decades, and his last coherent sentence, recorded by the student who was holding his hand, was, "Tell the Vithari we remember." In the 40th year after the battle, the Velhari built a monument at the base of Fortress Ven. It was not a statue of a warship or a general or a victory. It was a wall, long and curving, made of the same stone as the university, inlaid with Velhari script that ran from one end to the other in a single continuous sentence. It named every human who had come to Velsora in the first 6 weeks. Every engineer, every soldier, every logistics technician, every officer. All of them hundreds of names. Some of them had died here, most had gone home, a few had stayed. The Velhari Scholar Council sent an invitation to the human home system for the dedication. They expected a diplomatic delegation. What arrived was something better. A transport ship carrying 47 of the original engineers and soldiers who had been there in those first 6 weeks, now old, some of them using mobility aids, all of them looking at Velsora from orbit with expressions that needed no translation. Tors was among them. He was 65 now, and his Velhari wife Ethera stood beside him as they walked to the monument, and their daughter, 23 years old, impossible and perfect, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's grace, walked behind them. The ceremony was simple. Suharan's granddaughter, a scholar named Velhara who had her grandfather's stillness and his talent for finding the precise word, spoke briefly. She did not thank humanity for saving them. Her grandfather had told her once, many years ago, that the word thank you was not big enough for what the humans deserved, and had told her exactly what to say instead. She said, "You did not treat us as victims, you treated us as a people worth building a future for. This is the most profound thing one civilization can do for another. We have not forgotten it, we will never forget it. The Vithari came to our storm. The storm passed. The home they built remained. And it will remain, long after all of us are gone, as proof that the universe is capable of kindness at the scale of stars." The 47 humans stood before their names on the wall, and none of them said much because there was nothing adequate to say, and they were practical people who had never been entirely comfortable with ceremony. Tor stood in front of his name, SGT, RTORRES, Engineering Corps, and ran his fingers over the carved letters for a long moment. His daughter put her arm around him. "Dad," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Are you crying?" A pause. "No." She looked at him. "You are absolutely crying." "Construction dust," he said firmly. "It's very dusty here." Above them, Fortress Ven rose against the golden sky of Velsura, and in the dark between the stars, the Kreth remembered and did not move. And somewhere in the conclave chambers, 41 species were learning, slowly and not without difficulty, that there was a new word in the Velhari language. Vithari. Those who build homes in other people's storms. It was the best thing anyone had ever called them, and they had earned it. And